we have to wait until everyone agrees on how to act in order to address climate change, we are not going to address climate change. If you actually have actual existing radical decarbonisation that you can put on the table, then maybe, but that's not what we have. We have some extremely promising steps forward in slow decarbonisation. I really do believe that the fossil fuel era is coming to an end as a result of other energy technologies. If you are really concerned about the harms done by climate change, thinking about ways to mitigate those harms, not through just reducing emissions, but to actually stop the temperature being so high in the places where it is so terribly high, then you have to think about this.
Welcome to Saving the World from Bad Ideas. I'm Mark Lynas, and I've had a few bad ideas in my time. I used to go out in the nighttime to destroy GMO crops, and I also opposed nuclear power. But then when I looked at the science, I found I got it wrong. Oops! I've learned the hard way that none of us are right all the time. So now I'm here to challenge the assumptions that we all too often take for granted, because the future depends on us getting it right. Hello, Oliver. Welcome to the Saving the World from Bad Ideas podcast.
Hi, Mark. It's very nice to be here. I like saving the world from bad ideas.
Let me get this right. Our format of Saving the World from Bad Ideas. Now, we've got you on and you're saving the world from the bad idea of not talking about geoengineering. How's that sound?
Yeah, that's a little complicated, but it's your format and we're sticking to it. Yes, the idea is that not talking about geoengineering is a bad idea. And by not talking about geoengineering, we are doing a good thing and helping to save the world.
Okay, now I'm confused. But look, a bit about you to start with. Apparently, you have an asteroid named after you. Tell us this.
I do have an asteroid named after me. Yes, and that's because that's because I used to write about asteroids a bit. I was one of the people who wrote about asteroids way back when we really didn't know if anyone were going to hit us. And as a result, I knew the sort of people who discover and name asteroids, and so they gave me one. And I think I gave him a nice bottle of Chateauneuf-du-Pape.
Well, I mean, hopefully it's not one of the asteroids that's on a potential
No, it is, and this sounds terribly ungrateful. It's a slightly dull asteroid. It's sort of like a ways out in the main belt. It's about twice the size of Mount Everest. It's a substantial thing. But I don't imagine that any human being will ever have any reason to take note of it whatsoever for any practical purpose until the end of time.
Because it'd be a bit of an irony, wouldn't it, if the Oliver Morton... What's the name of it again?
It's called Oliver Morton.
Okay. I thought it had a longer sequence. A bit like
it has a number as well. It has a number as well.
Okay. But imagine if the Oliver Morton asteroid caused a mass extinction on Earth, that would be just an irony too far, wouldn't it?
Yes. Luckily, without the intervention of, sort of like some really, really nasty person, then that's not going to happen. It really is very, very safe. I assure you it's very, very safe.
Okay. Since it's your asteroid, I'll take it from you. Now, listen, 10 years ago you wrote this wonderful book, The Planet Remade, and on the back someone's written the first book to properly consider the dimensions of the new world we're living in. The Planet Remade is an indispensable, highly readable, and is incredibly timely. Mark.
Yeah,
Linus.
I wonder who could have said that.
Yeah. I just reread it because it's obviously I read it then to provide that quote, but I think it's interesting in some ways how it's very much stood the test of time, and that might be because the kind of geoengineering conversation hasn't really gone anywhere. I mean, I don't feel like we're in a totally different place from where we were when you wrote that book, do you?
I think we're in a different place, but not a totally different place. I think that the conversation has moved on, and to some extent, some new voices have entered the conversation. And by the conversation, I don't just mean the research conversation, but the conversation about whether we should be researching this. So it has moved on. It has obviously not been radically transformed, except to one extent, which is when I talked about geoengineering the book, I talk about both carbon geoengineering, which is removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, and solar geoengineering, which is reducing the amount of incoming sunlight to the atmosphere. And solar geoengineering, I think, is what you're thinking of when you say the conversation hasn't moved on very far, because carbon dioxide removal with the Paris climate conference, moved on a great deal, especially after the publication of the IPCC's Special Report 1.5. And so now there are lots of people trying to convince investors that they have technologies that can save the world through carbon dioxide reduction. And possibly more importantly and possibly more worryingly, almost all the scenarios that see humankind's keeping the climate below 2 degrees, the core goal of Paris, keeping climate change below 2 degrees, all that discussion now more or less assumes that fairly large amounts of carbon dioxide will be removed from the atmosphere in the second half of the century. So to that extent, we've sort of like moved into a world where that sort of geoengineering is assumed, it's baked in, even though we don't know whether it's actually doable and we don't know what mechanisms might lead people to do it.
Yeah, and in that sense, I find the carbon dioxide removal type of geoengineering actually less plausible, certainly less plausible in terms of the physics and engineering and the scale that's required to deploy it to remove, I don't know, a few tens of parts per million of CO2 from the atmosphere than the solar variant, which it's much simpler, much easier, and we know it would work from volcanoes. But so I don't know why you're allowed to have the CDR part in the models to make everything add up and make 2 degrees possible in the second half of the century, but you're not allowed to include the sunshade variant.
There are two different arguments there. One is that the models that people use to couple the economy to the climate for modeling purposes know how to do carbon dioxide removal, because you can take something it already knows how to do, which is carbon capture and storage, and you can link it up to something that burns biomass, and then you can get carbon dioxide removal in that model. There's no way in that model to include solar geoengineering, because it's just not part of the economy as that model sees it. And so one of the things is that these integrated assessment models, as they're known, so far have not been able really to capture solar geoengineering. Now, I'm told there are some researchers working on that, but solar geoengineering is kind of like an exogenous variable from the point of view of what those models do. The other thing is that carbon dioxide removal is actually effectively in the text of the Paris Agreement. So it has a certain sort of legitimacy from that. We talk about systems for removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And though there was some talk at Paris in some delegations that they were thinking that these were purely natural systems, that's not what the agreement says. And so Paris says that the idea is to stabilize the level of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere by balancing sources and sinks. And that's the concept that's given us net zero, and that's framed the discussion more or less from Paris onwards. And so it's kind of baked in, even though people don't really examine the fact that the incentives for really large-scale CDR are very hard, which is to say carbon dioxide removal, are very hard to see.
Yeah. Do you think, I mean, you talk about Paris, do you think that crossing 1.5 in real time, which was the sort of bottom level Paris Agreement limit, so I think it was, what was it, well below 2 degrees and pursuing efforts to reach 1.5 or something?
It's almost like you were there, Mark.
I actually wasn't there, but
really?
I was. Yeah, no, I know you were. I mean, you have fond memories of Paris, right?
I do, because the French organized it very well, and everyone was really, really keen on getting an agreement, and so there wasn't actually that much feeling of tension around it. But there were some nice restaurants. So Paris, compared to other COPs, the fact that it ended with a sense of achievement and it had nice restaurants really actually lifts Paris up in the annals of COPery.
Well, I trust you skipped Baku in that case, which was a different experience altogether.
I was unfortunately unable to join Baku. Yes.
Okay, back to 1.5 though. So as I say, we're sort of crossing it in real time. I know the precise definition. I think we have to have an average global temperature of above 1.5 for 20 years or something like that. But
no, we have to. Yes, yes, we have to have an average. But that may mean that we have actually already crossed it. If you believe that, and without going the full Jim Hansen, if you believe that the rate of warming is increasing, which is actually what most of the models suggest, you expect that that we might already be that when we go back and look at a 20-year average, you might find that we're already past the halfway mark.
And does this change the kind of tenor of the conversation about global warming limits in any way that you've observed? Because, you might, if you cross 1.5, we're heading towards 2. That begins to look increasingly implausible as well. So does that in any way push geoengineering higher into the higher up or into the conversation?
It has a little, and for instance, you can see a couple of years ago, Pascal Lamy chaired an overshoot commission that was devoted to thinking about what to do about the fact that the world was going to go over 1.5. And so the idea of the overshoot, which is an idea I should note that many people criticize as being a dangerous framing of the conversation, but the idea of the overshoot does lead you to thoughts about geoengineering, though largely to thoughts about removing carbon dioxide. Should it be changing the dialogue, should it be changing the discourse about solar geoengineering? Yes, I think it should. But as yet, it's doing so incrementally, not in some sort of like sudden phase change. Maybe that's good. I mean, maybe incremental is the way to go, but the amount of time we have left for incrementalism does seem to be shorter than it was.
I mean, I've worked, the jobs I've done is worked with the Climate Vulnerable Forum, as I think you know, which is 70 countries in the global south that are the most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change because they're small island states or they're high mountain countries or they're least developed countries, so they've got very little economic capacity to adapt. And you would expect these as the frontline countries most impacted by the global warming, effects that we're seeing right now, would be the ones to at least be having this discussion. But I've really not heard it. I've really not heard it talked about by anybody. And so that's what I mean about it. Not the conversation, not moving on at all. And it might be because this is still a sort of, and this comes back to the bad idea about not talking about it. It's still sort of a impermissible thing, I think, in the NGO kind of climate bubble. You really aren't allowed to talk about this seriously other than to say that it's a terrible thing and we shouldn't talk about it.
Yeah, and it's interesting there that you sort of like align the NGO climate bubble and the climate vulnerable and least developed countries. One of the things that I do, my main job is as an editor at The Economist, but one of my other roles is as the chair of the trustees of an NGO called the Degrees Initiative. And what Degrees exists to do is to provide developing countries with the wherewithal to study and develop opinions on solar geoengineering for themselves. And so what we do is we fund climate researchers in the global south who want to study solar geoengineering. We don't say anything about how they should study it, whether they should be in favor of it or against it. We want to build up a generation of scientists in the global south who can talk about this and then who can talk to civil society in their countries and who can talk to political leaders in their countries. This is to some extent a slow game, but it's an absolutely vital one because, as you say, this isn't going to happen if it happens at all. And serious discussion about this isn't going to happen until climate vulnerable nations are saying this is something we need to look at. And you were talking about 1.5. The thing that really bugs me about the sort of like normative climate discourse we have at the moment is when you have people like the Secretary General of the United Nations saying the world is already boiling and what we have to do is cut emissions so that the rate at which it gets even hotter slows down over the next 30 years. And that's just not that just doesn't, there's a disconnect between the seriousness, you might say the hyperbole, of saying that the world is already boiling, but not saying let's look at ways that might actually promptly reduce first the rate of warming and conceivably the absolute temperature. It's a disconnect in the discourse.
But there's always these disconnects, aren't there? I mean, you would expect the climate doomsters to support nuclear power, let's say, because they'll throw anything at the problem because it's so urgent and it's going to kill billions of people. But that's not the case. I don't want to get in. I don't want to go down the nuclear power rabbit hole. But just to say that the way that the Venn diagram of these different perspectives overlaps isn't how you'd imagine. It's not how it might make logical sense. It's about socially constructed, debates and tribalism and these kinds of things, really, isn't it?
Yeah, isn't there a Meatloaf song that's called something like "I'll do anything for love, but I won't do that"?
Yeah, yes, there is. Yeah.
And so, but when you hear people saying, "Yeah, the world is actually burning, but there are things I'm not willing to contemplate for that it should stop burning," that's a very difficult position to take. And yet people take it all the time.
They do, and there was I just looked this up, there was a solar geoengineering non-use agreement. I remember being sent this, and I had this horrible feeling that I'd actually signed it. So I went to look at it and look at the signatories and did a control F and checked, and thank goodness I never did, because in retrospect, I really don't agree with it. Not just because, I mean, there's three arguments that it makes. One is that we don't know enough, so we shouldn't do any research, which makes no sense to me. The second is the kind of moral hazard that if we find out more about geoengineering and it might work, then people might use it. Therefore, we shouldn't find out more about it. And the third was that the governance is just impossible, so we shouldn't do anything about it. And the form of words I even wrote down, this says to prevent the normalization of solar geoengineering as a climate policy option. So they really, they pretend this is about not using it, but they actually say very clearly that they want to close down the debate.
Yes, absolutely. And although there were people that I like and admire who signed that agreement, I do find that aspect of the agreement very, very hard to get my head around. But, I talked to someone like a leading Swiss climate modeler who I happen to know who's signed it. And he says, the moment it becomes taken seriously, all mitigation efforts stop the next day. And that's a worry that is a real worry. The degree to which what's sometimes called moral hazard or mitigation erosion, it's not something to rule out. You're not meant to. You can't just say, "Oh well, people would continue to reduce emissions." They might not, and that's part of the discussion you have to have. But to assume from the outset that is enough to make sure that you should never try it, that seems to me to be the wrong approach.
Yeah, it reminds me a bit of the old carbon fairy parable, if you remember. In fact, I used to use this for doomy audiences talking about nuclear power, that if you had a magic wand as a carbon fairy and you could wish away the additional carbon in the atmosphere, and we could carry on our lifestyles as they are, but without the global warming problem, would you do it? And the vast majority say no, because the people who tend to be in those audiences want us to change our lifestyles for all sorts of other reasons, to live in ways that they consider more virtuous and more desirable and so on. So it's solving the problem in an easy way is actually very unappealing to those who say they're most concerned about it, oddly.
Yeah, no, I think that's true, though I'd also like to stress that I think that A, solar geoengineering wouldn't be a solution, and B, it wouldn't be easy, though it might be technically quite readily accomplished. Easy goes a bit far. But yes, there is a deep sense, I think, within much green thought, and it's one that I have a certain sympathy with, that there's a rightness to the idea that individual human actions are balanced to nature. And that's absolutely a sense that solar geoengineering cannot supply. It's not it's about actually maintaining a world out of balance, maintaining a world where the amount of sunlight coming in is constrained to some extent so that the world doesn't get too hot. It's about one of the ways that I define both forms of geoengineering in the book is that they decouple the climate outcomes from the cumulative emissions. One does that by taking out some of the emissions. One does that by reducing the incoming sunlight. But decoupling from emissions means, to some extent, decoupling from both the economy and also from lifestyle choices. And if you have a grander view of the world as an environmentalist in which you want people to, as it were, live in some sort of harmony or balance, which, as I say, is a view that I think I understand, though don't actually feel able to share, then this doesn't look like a solution. It doesn't even look like it's really addressing the problem. At the same time, if you're thinking about the harm done by very, very high temperatures or periods of very high temperatures in vulnerable populations, if you're thinking about the harm done by rising sea levels, then if those are the things you worry about rather than lifestyles and overall nature balance, then you have to look at this sort of approach, I would think. And I don't, even saying it like that, I'm aware that sounds like I'm minimizing I'm traducing the sincerity of the people who want humans to live in harmony with nature. The problem is that for us to have effective climate action, that view has to be quasi-universal, and there's no evidence that that view can be made quasi-universal. And so if we have to wait until everyone agrees on how to act in order to address climate change, we are not going to address climate change.
No, I mean, if everyone has to learn to think like Naomi Klein, it's not only unlikely to happen, but you're likely to see a backlash. And I think we're seeing evidence of that obviously with the Trump administration and with the rise of far-right movements in so many different countries, often very illiberal and often very climate denialist as well. So the fact that the climate mitigation argument has become owned by the left, or at least seen that's how it's perceived, means that a lot of the right seems to have basically fallen out of love with any kind of action on climate change, net zero, and all of it gets thrown away. So for me, that's actually the bigger concern. I mean, do you share that or not?
I think broadly, I think that I don't think universally it's quite as polarized as people would like to, as some people would like to say, but I quite agree that there has been a level of cultural polarization. The fact, and it goes back more than 20 years, the fact that the prophet of climate change for Americans was Al Gore made it partisan to begin with. To some extent, there's nothing you're going to be able to do about that because since action on climate change involves disturbance to the economic status quo, it's going to involve disturbance to some vested interests. There is this cultural side to it too, and there's also a more generalized distrust of authority that plays in here as well. So, yeah, I think that I think that wanting everyone to agree before doing anything is a way of not doing something.
Yeah, so to the listeners or viewers who are new to this whole discussion, I realize we haven't talked through about what this looks like and what it might involve. So can you give us a bit on the technical side of how solar radiation management, aerosols and all of that might work, how we think, how we know from volcanoes that the climate can be cooled, stuff like that, just to get some of the basics straight here first?
Sure. And I think that sure, that's great. It's sometimes called solar radiation modification. It's sometimes called solar radiation management. It's sometimes called sunlight reflection methods. I try to avoid all of these, partly because solar radiation modification was actually invented as a joke about a stupid obfuscatory way to say solar geoengineering. I would rather say solar geoengineering. But sunlight reflection methods gets at something which is basically true, is that to reduce the amount of solar energy that comes into the Earth system and gets absorbed by the planet, what you want to do is reflect some sunlight more away into space. The most studied way to do this is to use a climate model and put more particles into the stratosphere so that you reflect away a little bit of sunlight. You tend to do this, and these models tend to do this on a global basis. Another approach is to brighten the thick, low stacks of cloud over some parts of the ocean. That's called marine cloud brightening. People have also looked at just putting white sheets over large parts of the land, though that isn't a particularly effective way. Another one would be sort of like feedback would be encouraging ice to spread further across the Arctic. That would reflect away light as well. But what these all have in common is that they reflect away sunlight before it's warmed the Earth. And one of the reasons why the stratospheric aerosols have the edge is that they're known. It's a known process, and it's a quasi-natural process. And that it's easily put into computer models. I said earlier that solar geoengineering is hard to put into the models that have the economy and the climate. But in models of what the atmosphere is doing, solar geoengineering is fairly easy. So when I say it's something that's observable, you mentioned volcanoes. Actually, I think for me, the key one, and this slightly reflects the way I came into the debate, is the first time a spaceship goes into orbit around Mars. There is a global dust storm around Mars, and as they watch it fade, they watch through the infrared the ground warm up, the Martian ground warm up. And as one of them says, one of the scientists involved says, this is the first time we have seen planet-wide climate change in nature. And that fed into a realization among Western scientists. Some Russian scientists already knew this, so we're talking in the 1970s, 80s here, that volcanoes on the Earth could change the climate. And that became both observed, proved, and actually measured with the eruption in the early 1990s of Mount Pinatubo in the Philippines, which led to a cooling of up to about 0.5 Celsius around the world in the subsequent year. So you actually saw. So what happens is, big volcano go boom. This transports an awful lot of dust and rock and ash and, crucially, sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere. Most of the solid stuff falls out. The sulfur dioxide spreads out and reacts with the small amount of water in the stratosphere to make little tiny particles of effectively sulfuric acid, little sulfate aerosols, very tiny things. They stay up in the stratosphere for months, a couple of years, and it's those particles, which are little glittery things, that are actually reflecting away the sunlight. And we can now look back in the historical record and recognize the effects of that after the much larger eruption of Tambora in 1815. We can see records in ice cores that show that at times when one of the proxies in the ice core shows that the temperature was dropping, another proxy shows that there's just been an injection of sulfur into the Earth's atmosphere. So we can see these kinds of things. We know that happens. It's not clear that it's a great detailed analog. In fact, it's not a great detailed analog for what one might actually do for solar geoengineering, because you put a huge amount of the stuff up there all at once in one place. Whereas to try and do this in what you might call a sensible way, if you're willing to stretch sensible that far. If you want to do it in a sensible way, you would inject the sulfur in a number of different places and you'd build it up over time. You wouldn't just go bang and leave it. But yeah, and more recently, and this is something that's mentioned in my book, but has now actually gone from being something to look at in the future to being something to look at in the now and the past. Humans emit a lot of sulfur into the lower atmosphere. And if you stop doing that, which you do if you clean up your coal plants or if you reduce your use of coal, you reduce the amount of sulfur you're producing, and that also has an effect on the climate. The amount of sulfur that's produced in burning coal is far greater than the amount that one might think about for solar geoengineering, but it stays near the surface of the Earth and falls out. At the moment, we're reducing that amount of sulfur, and we are seeing a linked rise in temperatures. That's not so which doesn't say that carbon dioxide isn't causing the main rise in temperatures. It is, but you're seeing now clear evidence that, for instance, the fact that China has hugely cleaned up its coal plants is leading to extra warming because there's less sulfate over the Pacific. You're also seeing that regulations reducing the amount of sulfur emissions from shipping are also having an effect. They're not huge effects, but they're real effects. So you're seeing human activity changing the climate in a way other than through carbon dioxide. That's happening, and it's happening for good reasons, because sulfate particles low down in the atmosphere kill a lot of people. At the same time, it means that people like the International Maritime Organization are taking deliberate steps, which, in the knowledge that they will make global warming worse.
Yeah, I mean, gosh, there's so much to get into there, but I've read at the moment that we're actually kind of reverse geoengineering, in that the albedo of the planet has been going
dropping
down, right? So the planet's getting darker, it's absorbing more.
Just since you say it, the albedo of the planet, I just want to say albedo is a really nice word that is basically bogarted by scientists, and science communicators like me have to try and find ways to avoid it. Otherwise, editors say, oh, what's albedo mean? Albedo is a really nice word. It just means how much sunlight something reflects away. The albedo of the cue ball is a lot greater than the albedo of the red ball in a game of billiards. And I just like the word albedo, and I think we should use it, but I think we do need to explain it to listeners.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. So I don't know, the shininess of the planet when viewed from space has been going down. So it's looking darker. And that's because we've been removing these tropospheric sulfate aerosols. And we should say the troposphere is where the weather happens, and that's where the clouds form and the rain comes and all of this. And the stratosphere is above that level. And so once volcanoes or something else puts these particles into the stratosphere, they can circulate for months or years, right? So that's the difference. And that being the case, it's just so obvious. Why not take the tropospheric aerosols that we've removed so we don't have to breathe them, put them into the stratosphere, and at the very least, we wouldn't be warming up the planet as rapidly as seems to be happening over the last year or two. If you believe Jim Hansen and the team there that's produced some of the latest work on this, it's really because of cloud feedbacks or something, there's fewer clouds, and so that's another reason why the planet's less reflective. I mean, we could be facing quite a dire situation as things are right now.
I think we are facing a dire situation. I mean, even if Jim Hansen is wrong, we're facing a dire situation. And most models show that, I think all models show that as you take out aerosols in the troposphere, which people are doing for good reason, just as to some extent they're putting carbon dioxide in for good reason because people want energy, because they're taking them out, the warming is increasing. And the trade-off that you point to, it was really made very clear in a seminal paper published in 2006 by the great atmospheric chemist Paul Crutzen, where he talked about this as being, a policy dilemma, paradox, that by cleaning up the environment, you were making entities like governments and regulators were making the planet warmer. And he said, well, put a little bit of sulfur into the stratosphere to make up for the great deal you're removing in the troposphere. A lot of people asked him not to publish that paper. Friends of his pressed him quite hard not to publish it. One of the reasons was that people, especially then, because it was not that long since, partly as a result of the work by Crutzen, people had seen how at risk the ozone layer was in the stratosphere. And there was a worry that putting more particles into the stratosphere would damage the ozone layer because it would provide surfaces on which ozone depleting reactions could take place. And that's a genuine worry. Paul thought that it wasn't a huge worry, and the fact that Crutzen, who had a Nobel Prize, the only atmospheric scientist at the time who'd ever won a Nobel Prize, Paul Crutzen thought this was worth trying, kind of gave people leave to think that it might be okay. And subsequent modeling has shown that there is an effect on ozone, but it's along the lines of slowing the rate at which the ozone layer recovers, not worsening the existing damage to it. So that idea that there's a trade-off between what we're doing at the surface of the planet and what we could do in the stratosphere, that's the essence of Crutzen's argument. And that really kicked off the modern debate about solar geoengineering. There was a big report by the Royal Society a few years later. Slowly, there have been more groups starting up at universities, but it's been a slow, marginalized, and largely academic discourse.
And I'm trying to figure out why this is, because at any sort of rational level, we are geoengineering the planet all the time. Every time you, start your car engine or light a bonfire, we're releasing these aerosols, which are changing the albedo reflectivity of the planet, putting CO2 in, removing CO2. All of these things are affecting the planet's energy balance. And so add them all together. Why can we not say that what we're currently doing is geoengineering, albeit an inadvertent geoengineering? So why is there this step change where we imagine that doing anything in the stratosphere is a complete, paradigm break from everything that's gone on before?
Well, I think there's a lot to you've been much less long-winded than I have, but have still brought an awful lot of ideas to unpack into that question. One of the answers is that what one does in an everyday way doesn't feel like geoengineering. The intention is not climate change. Now, I'm sure we could go back to Aquinas, as people like J.D. Vance and Rory Stewart like to do, and argue about the doctrine of double effect. But when people, by and large, when people burn things, they kind of know about the climate effect, but that's not why they're doing it. Whereas this would be an express, purposeful action on a large scale. And it's also, I think, there's another reason in which saying, "Well, we're already geoengineering" is a little wrong, because in the words of David Keith, who's been one of the people who's worked most on this, he's now at the University of Chicago, used to be at Calgary, then at Harvard. David's made the point that there's a difference between engineering and making a mess. There's an intentionality, central intentionality, and a central role of design in engineering, which there isn't in just mundane activities. And in a way, that makes things sound safer, intentional and designed, all sounds good. But to some people, that's actually more worrying, because the idea is that, some sort of nebulous authority or some sort of other nation will take control over fundamental aspects of the climate. That's not something people really want to think about unless they have to think about it. And so far, they've managed to convince themselves that they don't have to think about it.
Yeah, I know. I think that's bang on, and I think it's the intent is actually at the sort of center of our moral code and legal code as well. In many ways, it's a bit like the difference between manslaughter and murder. I mean, the person's still dead, but the intent is a critical thing there.
Yeah. Yes, that's true. I mean, but the other thing is that there's this concept of the techno fix, this idea that you're using technology to fix the problem so that you don't have to fix the underlying cause of the problem. And I'm quite paid up to that. I don't think anyone involved in research in this area doesn't think that solar geoengineering should be, as it were, a complementary therapy, and emissions reduction should continue to be the primary process, because you don't want a situation where what the greenhouse effect is doing and what the sunlight is doing are getting more and more out of balance. More and more greenhouse, less and less sunlight. That's not going to be a good way to go. No one wants that future, as far as I can see. And I know most of the people who think about this future at all. At the same time, people do worry, and to some extent rightly, that in a world where solar geoengineering is, even if a world where solar geoengineering is widely discussed as a near-term possibility, all the emphasis on mitigation will go. And as I say, I don't in any way dismiss that argument. I just don't think it's a strong enough argument in and of itself to justify a taboo. And Crutzen himself says this, that he says at the end of that paper in 2006 that he would much rather that we just stop the emissions or reduce the emissions drastically. But he then goes on, after the experience of the last decades, that's a pious hope. And if it was a pious hope in 2006, I don't know what, 40% of the carbon dioxide emitted since the Industrial Revolution has probably been emitted this century, maybe more, still a pious hope. If you actually have actual existing radical decarbonization that you can put on the table, then maybe, but that's not what we have. We have some extremely promising steps forward in slow decarbonization. I really do believe that the fossil fuel era is coming to an end as a result of other energy technologies. But I don't think it's coming to an end by 2035, and I don't think anyone else seriously does.
Well, and it's not coming to an end in time to keep us below the Paris limits of. Well,
yeah, that's what I mean.
Agree.
Absolutely, because that's why I said 2035, because typically speaking, the limits for 1.5 actually they're more stringent than that now. But they used to be that we have to stop emitting within 10 years, and the planet is not going to stop emitting. Industrial civilization is not going to stop emitting within 10 years. The sort of things that could stop 8 billion people, well, about 1.5 billion people emitting quite a lot of carbon dioxide, and about 5.5 billion people emitting some, and the other billion people wishing that they could have the energy anyway. Yeah, that's not going to happen in 10 years.
No, completely. But in that case, why is literally nobody I've come across who I'd take seriously making the argument that we should do this? I mean, even you're not saying that. You're saying we should talk about it and we should think about it. We should research it. Presumably, if I was to put you on the spot and say, should we do this? Do you have a yes or no answer?
Yeah, but it's no. It's not a yes and no answer, because it's conditional, because it says this is actually something that came to me while I was writing my book. and which I feel quite strongly, is that people make this assumption, and I'm sure I've made it a dozen times in talking to you, that there's a we that can make that sort of decision. And there isn't. You have to constitute the we. That's what politics is about, making people into we's and also allowing different groups to agree on things. I think that we should be. See what I did?
You said we. Yeah,
exactly.
Said we.
Yeah. I think that it would be a good idea if a number of nations were seriously researching the possibilities of this and seriously engaging in a global debate about it. I've suggested that you might do this under the Environmental Modification Treaty in the UN, because the UNFCCC doesn't really cover it. There are other ways you might do it, but basically have the discussion and also work on the science and technology, because so far there's a very self-selected group working on this, and they're not zealots. We're not zealots, and I can use we there fairly. But, the idea that we're not prone to groupthink would make us unlike any other group of people ever. As it happens, most of the natural scientific research done in the last 20 years, in the 20 years since Crutzen, most of that research has tended to show that a sensible, relatively small-scale program, so one that was designed to slow the rate of warming or to cap the warming at 1.8 degrees, something like that, which doesn't require a huge action. The geophysical side effects of that, the biogeophysical side effects of that, do not appear to be either globally terrible or particularly bad for any one place. There are some places where it might be marginally worse than the effect under global warming, but it's the overall, the net benefit is a big positive net benefit in those models. One, there may be some things that those models are missing. I don't think they're particularly good yet, for instance, on agricultural responses. Two, what those models can't take into account is the international political setting, in which if someone's doing this that you don't like and something bad happens in your country, you will feel very aggrieved. And so I have friends who work in international relations who tell me this will never happen. No one will give up, as it were, sovereignty over their climate for the common good. Those are the debates we have to have. And it is frustrating that, for instance, and I do actually want to keep coming back to him. It's very frustrating that the Secretary General talks a lot about climate and never talks about this sort of thing. And, people who understand diplomacy better than I say, well, the leader can't be too far ahead of those he's leading. And A, I don't think the Secretary General is really a leader in any normal sense. And B, it's not clear that he's ahead in any way. It's not like he feels that he's being pulled back from this. So I agree. It's kind of remarkable that the debate isn't being had. I mean, you were kind enough to say some nice things about my book. It's kind of remarkable that, if not the best, it's still a pretty good book 10 years on. I would like it to be out of date.
Well, I started off by saying it still felt very current, and I wasn't sure that was a good thing in terms of the debate not having moved. So,
well, let's let us have it both ways. Let's say it's a jolly good book anyway, and it's wisdom for the ages. But at the same time, it would be kind of nice if some of the stuff had. I mean, some things, as I said, the book talks about the fact that the IMO is going to warm up the planet by removing sulfates from shipping, and it did so.
Duly happened like the last couple of years, really, didn't it? So I'm just like, for We Planet, I'm wondering whether I should write a report saying, okay, let's respect the Paris targets. Let's just, whoever the we is, make a decision to stay below 2 degrees. We could literally do that with solar geoengineering and down the carbon emissions. I mean, you want to get them down as rapidly as possible to reduce the risk of termination shock, which we can come on to discuss in a minute. But no, I don't know of any NGO. I mean, we could do it We Planet because we like saying the unsayable and just trying to push at boundaries and get people thinking. But I'm not sure I could say that and really mean it because it just feels like a huge risk.
Yeah, but I would be worried if you felt you could say that, Mark, because you're incredibly winning. You're an incredibly winning advocate, and from my experience, from having known you for longer than we might both want to remember, one of the conditions for your advocacy is that you have to be against something before you're for it. So I think that we are actually sort of like witnessing the tipping of the Lynas point at the moment. It is a really hard thing to go out there and say, if someone started geoengineering in the stratosphere tomorrow, I would be happy, not sad. I would be glad they were doing it. That's a very hard place to get because so much is built into us not to say that. At the same time, if you are really concerned about the harms done by climate change, thinking about ways to mitigate those harms, not through just reducing emissions, but to actually stop the temperature being so high in the places where it is so terribly high, then you have to think about this. And I agree, it's pretty hard to say yes, and I would, because there's a certain amount of pig in the poke here, right? I would like a good, wise geoengineering program, but I don't know of any process at the global level which is run well and wisely at the moment. I mean, to some extent, I wrote the book during the Obama presidency. I had a slightly greater faith in the idea that people could come together and do the right thing when I wrote that book than I do now in 2025.
Well, I mean, you're right about me having to be against something before I'm for it, and I've got previous on that in a number of issues, as you rightly say.
Yeah, and you've been right, and it's been good.
But the thing is, it's even worse for this issue because I was against it 6 months ago when I was writing my book about nuclear winter, and for me, this raises the termination shock issue, which is, because so for nuclear winter, this is like the one thing I think much more than climate warming, which could destroy civilization very, very quickly indeed in a matter of hours for the initial conflagrations and then weeks and years for the nuclear famine driven by the winter and sort of agricultural and ecological collapse. So I got into looking at this and what the analogs might be for nuclear winters in the past, and volcanic winters are quite good ones potentially and might even be associated with mass extinctions. And I was thinking, I wonder whether long-term warming, a sort of background of long-term warming with a volcanic winter superimposed on it, and the kind of climate zigzag, almost like termination shock that might imply, could be the main mechanism for mass extinctions throughout the last 500 million years. I mean, isn't that an interesting thing? And so let's look at the termination shock question. So the thing is, if we carry on emitting, then the lag between you explain it. Come on, you can do a better job.
Okay, I will explain it as the so-called termination shock. If you have, imagine in 2040, someone or other starts a solar geoengineering program designed to keep the climate stable, keep the temperature stable. And imagine that people don't stop emitting. And so the level of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere keeps going up, and the level of aerosols in the stratosphere keeps going up. So and the system gets further and further out of balance, so that if you stop putting aerosols into the stratosphere and they all fall out within a couple of years, then you suddenly unmask the warming that's due to the carbon dioxide that's gone in since 2040 that you weren't paying attention to. And this is actually something people talk about, the removal of sulfur from the troposphere at the moment, as a termination shock. You can find that in the literature, that we have removed some sulfur emissions and as a result seeing the rise. It's obviously a conceivable phenomenon. And I think you're right that it can happen. At a time when there's secular warming and a catastrophic short-term cooling, this could be particularly harmful. At the same time, there are various things to think about this. One is that although it's demanding, stratospheric aerosol injection isn't incredibly difficult, and it is geopolitically almost inconceivable. In fact, I might go as far as say inconceivable, that if one major power block developed that capability, the others would not. It's like, for instance, the fact that at some times, for some values, Europe has been closely allied to America doesn't mean that Europe hasn't been wanted to build its own space launchers for its own spy satellites. It doesn't mean that Europe hasn't built its own airline industry. It doesn't mean that Europe hasn't built its own global positioning satellites. These are sort of strategic industries that governments can understand. If we live in a world where the stratosphere is being modified for solar geoengineering, it's inconceivable that only one person can do that for any length of time. And so the idea that there'd be a termination shock because one country would sort of like get bored, or there'd be a revolution in one country or whatever, it doesn't seem to me to make first order sociological geopolitical sense. There would be someone to take up the slack. In fact, one of the worries about geoengineering is that if everyone does it, you'll get more of it than you actually, in some sense, need. So I think anything that stops solar geoengineering really quickly and radically, I think is so unlikely that its harm is going to be already on a par with the fast warming you get otherwise. I mean, the obvious thing is war, a nuclear war. I think that there's a sense in which the winter after a nuclear war might be made worse by also the succession of geoengineering that had been going on before that war. But as you say, the winter after a nuclear war is so utterly, completely cataclysmic that the biggest worry I have about geoengineering is that it might raise the risk of nuclear war. And I think we were both at a sort of like a scenarios planning meeting about this that still hasn't produced a paper a year and a bit ago. And that was something that we were bonding on there, that, this is the biggest worry, is that it breaks down some level of international trust to a catastrophic degree. So I don't think termination shock, and the other thing is, I think you don't want to do geoengineering where the termination shock would be more than a few tenths of a degree centigrade. So that's one of the reasons why saying you've got to keep the mitigation going, because you don't want the risk of a serious termination shock. The other one, of course, is, and this is again one that Paul Crutzen pointed out because he was way smart, given that you worry about acidification of the oceans, solar geoengineering does nothing for that, almost nothing for that. And that actually means that there's always an independent reason for wanting to reduce emissions. And so sometimes critics of solar geoengineering say, well, it doesn't do anything about the ocean acidification. Have you thought of that? And apart from thinking, yes, you idiot, of course I've thought of that. I've actually been thinking about this for years, and you've been thinking about it for the last hour. Beyond that sort of like set of that reasonable but unbecoming peak, you also say that's not a bug, that's a feature. If geoengineering didn't leave the ocean acidification problem, it would be even worse in terms of moral hazard, because it would remove a really good reason, climate independent reason for reducing carbon dioxide emissions.
Yeah, I mean, mentioning that workshop we both went to, they were looking at geoengineering as an existential risk, if I remember rightly. And I think the only one that people could think of that was properly existential was that geoengineering in some way caused a nuclear war through some geopolitical reason.
Absolutely.
And then I'm like, well, that's a nuclear weapons existential or nuclear war existential risk. It's not actually to do with putting sulfates in the stratosphere.
If we want to move into sort of like idealized Morton Lynas world, we would say, well, part of what's necessary in an agreement for the governance of solar geoengineering is serious nuclear disarmament, because we want to make sure that if anything goes, the two could go hand in hand. I'm reaching out to you, brother. I know.
Thank you. I appreciate it. And it's pretty much the argument. I'm making an upcoming book, which is coming out quite soon. Because, I mean, I'm serious about this, though. There seems to be this disconnect in all of these discourses about existential risk, where people totally forget about the one that doesn't happen to be their area of specialism. So, like, there's the nuclear disarmament people, there's the climate people, there's the pandemics people, presumably. There's relatively little overlap between them. And with nuclear weapons, we've designed these, I think you've said yourself, we've designed these machines which can basically eliminate civilization in a matter of hours. And they're all sat there in the oceans and submarines and on silos, ready to go, at 6 minutes warning is how I put it in the book. And the amount of debate about this is tiny, trivial, certainly compared to climate change.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I am the choir to whom you are preaching. No, there's one thing, there's another thing that sets off nuclear um, nuclear considerations of existential threat to others. I mean, apart from the fact that we've actually seen a nuclear war, which
By that
is
you mean
the end
Hiroshima
of
and
World War II.
Nagasaki.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But I remember seeing this and remarking on it after being at an existential risk seminar, different one in Cambridge.
We have fun, don't we?
Oh, we do, yes. Well, actually, you say we have fun. That's slightly the point. I was struck by how the pandemic and asteroid impact and all those other existential risk people, they don't have anything like the delightful, dark sense of humor that the nuclear policy wonks have. Someone I'm sure about the arms control and disarmament specialist Jeffrey Lewis. He's a very funny guy. They're very, very dark jokes. I remember being at a nuclear weapons meeting in DC and seeing someone on Twitter say, there are things people are laughing at in here, which if they were said on the streets would cause a complete meltdown. It's the only way to respond.
And they love rockets, don't they? They love different types of missiles and they're kind of getting into the wonkery of that.
Oh, yes. Well, that is why Jeffrey Lewis's podcast, which I recommend, is called Arms Control Wonk, because they really do like getting their wonk on.
Okay. Right, Oliver, I think we've sort of advanced the conversation.
Well, where have you come down,
advanced the conversation sufficiently to challenge the bad idea of not talking about it here?
Well, yeah, I think we have. And that's really for the listeners who felt that it was a good idea to listen to this to the end of the podcast. I'd be very interested. I don't know what sort of feedback you have on this podcast, but I'm interested in feedback from you. I feel that you're moving on this subject.
What, me personally?
Yeah.
So do I, and I hate having an open mind in real time. It's quite destabilizing. I'm sort of like the opposite of a polemicist. I mean, this is why, I've been invited to be a columnist for various things at different times, and I literally read a few months later on, I think, God, what a stupid thing I totally disagree with that. And so you end up holding opinions very lightly. And so I've toned down the bit in the book about how geoengineering would be terrible, based on the analogy of volcanic winters. And so, because I think you were right to draw attention to that when you very kindly looked at it. I do think that the problem is nobody's making a case for this, other than some weird carbon trading companies who apparently sell carbon credits by putting tiny amounts of
they're not carbon credits. Even they don't claim they're carbon. They call them cooling credits. And you're thinking of a company called Make Sunsets. And it's maybe it's useful because it gets people talking about these things, but it also gets people talking about them in all the wrong way, because the vibe is a bit unpleasantly tech bro, and the practical effect is nil, and the fact that it looks like a scam is a fact. It looks like a scam. So yeah, whether all publicity is good publicity, it's hard to say on this respect. But yeah, the really serious debate, I mean, bless them, the Overshoot Commission had a good chapter on solar geoengineering, but people did not choose to take it to their hearts.
Mm-hmm. Well, I also take from you that we need to have this conversation in the climate vulnerable countries. I think it has to come from the global south.
Absolutely.
If it's going to have any legitimacy. So, yeah.
No, what we believe at Degrees is absolutely that this is a debate that has to be called for and led by the global south.
Rather than by billionaires.
Yeah.
All right, let's leave it there, Oliver. I'm so grateful for your time, and I think people would have learned a lot from this. I think I'm on the very, very edge of changing my mind again, which is, as I say, a horrible feeling, but I'm all too familiar with it. So thanks again for being
okay. Well, I'll check in with you on the next cycle of the oscillation. Thanks very much, Mark. It was great to have a talk with you.
Fabulous. Thanks, Oliver. Thanks so much for listening to Saving the World from Bad Ideas, a We Planet podcast. We Planet's a movement of citizens and scientists dedicated to defending the science and solutions we need to save the world. Please do subscribe and share a nice review. It helps us spread the message. We'd also love to hear your feedback and suggestions at our email, podcast@weplanet.org. Please also join our podcast mailing list and we'll let you know when a new episode drops. Just go to savingtheworldfrombadideas.org or weplanet.org/podcast right now. See you next time.